Thank you very much for that. We're all feeling invigorated now after an ice cream, some caffeine and a sing-song, which set us up very nicely for the final session of the day. And this time we're addressing this question: what opportunities exist for sustainable enterprise in terms of climate adaptation and building resilience? And this is a topic that's very close to Maura Boone's heart, given the Business Adaptation Network is an important dimension of the activities of Green Cross Australia. I'm sure Maura will be sharing a few things about that Business Adaptation Network during the session. Am I right, Maura? You're going to weave it in somehow? And as per the last session, I'll leave it to Maura to introduce this illustrious panel.
Okay, fantastic. And yes, this is extremely close to my heart. For those of you that haven't heard of Green Cross Australia, we essentially are a network of people, educators, business leaders, politicians, anyone who has an interest in cultivating resilience, not just to the impacts of climate change, but to all the underlying stresses that reduce our capacity to respond to challenges. And we're really excited that the opportunities around this adaptation are real, and that there's signals of some wonderful work that's happening in that space. Before I introduce the panel, if I could have the early slides, I wanted to introduce you to the Business Adaptation Network, which actually John Hewson helped us to launch about a year ago now in Parliament House in Canberra. And this is essentially a group of large businesses that want to work with governments, community organizations, the research sector, around positive examples of good adaptation that can both reduce our emissions and cultivate community safety, our ability to weather through major natural disasters and so forth. And as you can see, you know, it really pivots around this idea that partnership and collaboration is actually the secret now to moving ahead. And I know that can be counterintuitive. I spent time working at Greenpeace. I also, you know, am very aware of, you know, the conflict model that exists in advocacy in the community sector. But my own view is now that it's very clear from the science that we may actually be pointing at beyond 4 degrees. So we really must get with it. And that's what the Business Adaptation Network is all about. And you can see that from 1 or 2 members, we've now expanded to include, you know, leaders in the property sector, energy, water, the engineering community, built environment, finance, and everyone is welcome to join. So if you are a business and would like to be a part of this network, and clearly Pacific Hydro and DLA Piper should be members, but we're delighted that Greg Johnson is here. So I might just close on this idea that together we can share some really, really positive ideas about how things can move forward. And I'll start by introducing Greg, who is a sustainability manager with Stockland. Stockland, I think, is, if not the country's largest developer, very large.
Diversified.
Diversified, that's what it is. But retirement villages, master plan communities, you know, a very, very large footprint on our built environment. Mark Baker-Jones is a special counsel at DLA Piper, which is the world's largest law firm. And Mark specializes in the climate risk associated with the planning rules by which our communities are built. And of course, in Australia, 85% of us live very close to the coast. And we know through sea level rise that things are changing. And when you combine the gradual shifts with major events, the rules of planning, building, construction are changing, the liability around that, and opportunities also come from that. Lane Crockett is the Executive General Manager for Pacific Hydro, which is a renewable energy company that specializes in hydro and wind. They have some other renewable investments. They work in Australia, in Brazil, and in Chile. And we're very excited to start the narrative of renewable energy as a means of cultivating resilience, because as we'll hear, when we have things like heat waves, which are the single most deadly natural disaster in Australia, the capacity of renewable energy to stabilize the grid and it is a very different phenomenon. And as we get battery storage and are able to have microgrids, we'll have a very different community safety element to how we all get through what lies ahead. Now, Kate Van Homrigh. Did I do it? Yay! So Kate is very special. I only met her just now, but she's a consultant at Ernst & Young, and she has, I think, an engineering degree and, works in their general practice here in Brisbane. But she's here in her capacity as a champion, an ambassador for a group that I personally am very moved by and have mentored a whole bunch of young people, and I just am so excited by this group. It's called Pollinate Energy. And it comes out of the University of New South Wales, and these are young people who are turning on its head this claim that somehow the future of poverty alleviation is about coal to bring energy to the world. And instead they focus on small-scale solar in the slums of Bangalore. And it is a story which is all about resilience. So we might invite Mark Baker-Jones to open up with some short comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mara, and thank you to Griffith and especially to the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise for initiating this conference and for inviting me to be on this panel. I want to avoid giving too much background, but again, I will begin by looking at what we mean by climate legal risk, because it's in continual flux, and there's a danger that unless we understand what climate legal risk really means, there's a risk that we may not understand how to deal with it. So I don't want to lose anyone, and I'll try and keep it simple, but when we choose to make a decision and that decision relates to or it attracts a liability, we have to consider the risk of the failure to make the correct decision and then the resulting consequential cost. So the first point is that we're looking at the cost to the decision maker for their decision. Now, another way to look at this is if we have a decision and there's an obligation relating to that decision, we have to consider the possibility of failing to meet that obligation. So essentially we're talking about the risk to the decision maker of making a wrong decision. And in law, we think about where that obligation comes from. Now, if the power to make that decision arises out of a statutory or a common law obligation, then we think about the legal risk that that decision maker bears. And typically we think about liability in terms of the tort of negligence, or we think about whether that decision might be judicially or administratively reviewed. But when we talk about climate risk, you might say that we add another layer to that, or a new set of factors to consider. And a simple way of looking at that is increased uncertainty can lead to an increase in the range of risk. And that adds complexity in terms of the assessment required, even if the process is unchanged. And in terms of climate change, it brings in a lot more uncertainty, which needs to be taken into account when we consider that risk. So that's what makes up a large part of what I talk about when we're talking about climate legal risk. So very, very broadly, climate legal risk is that legal risk that accompanies a decision that's either affected by climate change or a decision that will affect climate change. And as the science and the understanding of the causes of climate change and the impacts of climate change improves, we actually get more certainty, so the complexities in that respect would potentially diminish. But when it comes to the law, it gets tricky. So what if, for example, if we have a new law? Well, that new law might change, and that could increase or decrease the risk depending on your position. So let's say, for an example, there's a situation, there's some uncertainty about whether a decision maker will be found to have acted negligently if a decision maker makes a certain decision, and because the law is ambiguous in some relevant way. Now, if the uncertainty in the law is removed, then we expect that legal risk to diminish. And I'm sorry if this is a bit heavy going, but depending on the change in the law, it may diminish that the risk, or it may increase it. So when we're dealing with decision makers in the law, we really have two variables. We have the uncertainty attracted around the law, and we have uncertainty around the practices of this decision maker. Now, on top of that, there are also other things to consider, and that's how that law changes, whether it's a statutory change or whether it's a change through a new precedent from the court. So it all gets very, very complex. Now we can look at the broader question of how climate legal risk are influencing adaptation and planning, and I'll give you some examples, and these are all examples from the US, but they show the ingenuity of thought that climate change causes. But before I do that, it's also useful to consider where the law might stand on this. Now, the law we have in Australia has its roots in a very important aim, and that's to protect against oppression from tyrants. Now, I'm pleased to say I've never had a tyrant as a client. I don't think I have. But the point is that fundamentally law, or some say it should be, is about justice and the rights of people. So some say that that's what lawyers should strive for. We should be looking at preserving and protecting the rights of people. So my response comes from that perspective. And from that perspective, I can make observations about how justice is being dealt with and attempted in terms of climate change. So back to the examples, the threat of negligence claims against local governments is probably one of the key things that pops into mind. And I'm thinking of a recent case in the US. It's one of the most high-profile ones, although it was eventually withdrawn, and that was the farmers' insurance claim against a large number of local governments in Illinois. Now, what was striking about this case was that it was the insurers suing local governments for their losses because the insurers claimed that local governments knew about climate change and had not responded appropriately to it. So, for example, despite having climate change adaptation plans and climate change adaptation strategies, they hadn't implemented these and they hadn't upgraded their infrastructure to deal with climate change impacts. Now, that gave rise to a call from the Cook County local government attorney, Michael DeGaldo, that the Illinois legislature should indemnify towns and cities against liability for negligence relative to climate change. Now, I mentioned to you, Mara, last week, here in Australia, the Whitsunday Regional Council passed a resolution a short time ago, a couple of weeks ago, that the Mayor, Jenny Whitney, write to the state member to ask for funding to carry out a climate change study. And if funding wasn't available, they asked the member to provide the council and the individual councillors with appropriate public liability indemnity. That's probably a legitimate request, and it gives an insight into how local governments are feeling about climate legal risk, not just here in Australia, but also overseas. So back to the farmers' insurance action. It hinged largely on negligence claims, but it also relied on a constitutional argument that the government stormwater infrastructure was deficient, so private property acted as a temporary retention basin for the floodwaters. Now, the farmers' insurance claimed that a failure to pay compensation for the use or the temporary taking of that private land for this purpose was contrary to a constitutional guarantee that any taking should be on just terms. Now, there are parallels with the climate change related matter that we're running at the moment, which we're seeking special leave to the High Court. And in that case, our case deals with Australians' carbon emissions targets under obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. But it also deals in a similar way with the breach of the equivalent Australian version of that constitutional guarantee. Now, the facts are very different, but we've received a concession that a taking of a certain right could arguably be said to involve an acquisition of property. So these sort of arguments aren't without merit. There are some other very interesting examples where the law is or it could potentially affect behaviour, and I'm talking particularly about climate change. So there were two guys a few weeks ago who anchored their lobster boat behind a coal barge to stop it leaving port in Massachusetts. Essentially what they did is they took a lobster boat, they got a huge anchor, they parked behind the barge and they dropped the anchor and they couldn't lift it up. So they had to get a crane in and it delayed the barge going out for a day. Now, they claimed a defence in engaging in an act of civil disobedience under the legal principle known as necessity. And the necessity defence argues that whereas you may have broken the law, you did it in order to prevent a larger crime from occurring. And in this case, that crime was climate change. Now, that defence didn't get tested in that case because they reached a deal with a very sympathetic District Attorney, who later said, "Climate change is one of the greatest crises our planet has ever faced. In my humble opinion, the political leadership in this issue has been sorely lacking." Now, these sort of defences, they may still see their day, because we know that later this month there is a flotilla of people from a number of Pacific nations who are planning to descend on Newcastle Port to draw attention to Australia's coal exports and climate change. Another interesting argument is that of public trust doctrine, which is a principle that says that certain resources are preserved for public use, and that it's the duty or the government is required to maintain these for public's reasonable use. So there's been a number of climate change related cases in the US relying on this public trust doctrine, and one was recently heard in Alaska. And in that case, the claimants are miners, little miners, who claim that the state has violated its duties under the Alaskan Constitution and that public trust doctrine by failing to take steps to protect the atmosphere in the face of significantly and potentially disastrous climate change. But one of the interesting developments in terms of climate legal risk is the introduction of laws that seek to deal explicitly with climate change, and we may talk about those later. So I'll finish there. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, fantastic. And I'm all shall come out in the Q&A, and I'll have to control myself so that others get to ask the question. Greg.
Thanks, Mara. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for staying for this final session. It's good to see the room so full of interested people. I guess I'm talking to you from the point of view of a large ASX 50 company, property owner, developer, manager, looking at trying to understand what our exposures are and what our vulnerabilities are in terms of climate change, looking at how we put in place actions to respond to that, and then the challenge beyond that is to look at how we turn that into a policy and process, and we embed that within our systems and our processes in how we manage our vulnerabilities and our exposures as a result. So we've been working on this for about 4 years now, and in that time we've actually experienced quite a number of very severe weather events. Around about the time that we started on this strategy was around, I think it kind of all started with the flooding in central Queensland and Rockhampton. We had a shopping centre in Rockhampton that was exposed to that flooding. Then soon after that we had Cyclone Yasi, so we had shopping centres in Cairns and Townsville that were exposed to that. And then after that, of course, we had the Brisbane floods, so we had an office building in the Brisbane CBD that went underwater. So around about the time we were sort of building some consciousness around climate adaptation and resilience, we were actually experiencing that. So it was actually, aside from the human tragedy that went with it, it was actually a very opportune time for all of that to happen. In Queensland, we have quite a strong presence and exposure. I mentioned, cyclones and floods, but we've got 12 shopping centres throughout Queensland. 6 of those are in North Queensland. We've got a large residential housing development pipeline, so we've already released 25,000 lots to the market, and we've got another 28,000 lots in our pipeline. We've got a retirement living business with 6 retirement villages with a total of 1,100 homes and a further 600 new homes in the pipeline. So, we've got quite a strong interest in Queensland, but with that comes exposure. With the release of the APCSE Fifth Assessment Report, and we heard from someone today talking about that, we can expect future climate impacts to include increased costs from weather-related damage, disruption to supply chain and business interruption, rising energy and water demand affecting the stability of the grid, and effects on human health and safety impacting on productivity. So for Stockland, with our national coverage, we're very likely to experience the full gamut of climate predictions this summer. And according to Sky News, they published their severe weather report just last week. We can expect above average temperatures with heat waves in Melbourne, Canberra, Adelaide and Perth. Because of the El Nino that's been developing this year, we'll see below average rainfall for northern, central and the eastern parts of the country. We could see up to 12 tropical cyclones to develop, with 4 expected to hit the coast. That's actually down on last year again because of El Nino, oddly enough. 4 of those cyclones predicted for Queensland, with 1 expected to hit the coast. So I guess it's an expectation that we have every year, and I think, is it this week, Mara, they launch Get Ready Queensland, or sometime in the next couple of weeks. So look, it's a very appropriate time to be raising awareness and building preparedness around these things. I guess to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing around vulnerability and resilience, most of the work that I've done myself has been in shopping centres. My colleagues have also done work in our retirement and our residential business. But in that time, I guess 2 things have become very clear to me. One is that climate adaptation is not always about what we do in the event of a natural disaster. It's as much about what we do in the day-to-day as we experience the incremental effects of climate change. So for us, it's about how do we turn this into an operational response as much as it is an emergency response. And it's also really important to ensure that we understand and manage those exposures so that we can offer a more resilient trading environment for our retailers. So for Stockland, we own and operate shopping centres. If the roof leaks or the air conditioning fails or something goes wrong in the operation of that shopping centre, it leads to a loss of trade that obviously impacts Stockland and impacts our stakeholders, our shareholders potentially in the worst extreme. So it's important for us to understand what the risks are and manage those. So the day-to-day climate impacts can be for us really to do with the increase in the number of days above 35 degrees and the increase in the number of 1 in 100 year rain events. They're two climate impacts that I guess have the most significance for us. So they determine the impact on the centre in a number of ways, but whether it leads to power failures, water leaks, or a loss of indoor comfort. The vulnerability of our shopping centres determines how they respond. So those that are quite vulnerable don't respond well at all, whereas those that have greater levels of resilience respond better. But on top of that, we believe we have a role in the community because our shopping centres are a place of respite on the hot days, on the wet days, on the windy days. So understanding the decisions that we need to make to improve the resilience, not just of the physical asset, but of how we provide that respite to our customers and how that helps us trade better is really important to us. So we've done around 20 climate resilience assessments across our portfolio. We work to develop a methodology on how we do that. So we look at the regional exposures across the country, we look at the physical attributes of the centre, and then we look at what the potential impacts are as a result of location and design. So we've done 20 of those. 14 of those have been in shopping centres. We've done 6 on our residential communities and in our retirement villages as well. So the idea was to understand what the regional exposures are in a range of geographic locations so that we can test the theories around sea level rise, we can test the theories on increased cyclone intensity or just the number of hot days that might occur in some exposed regions. So in terms of residential though, we've got a very large residential development, a master plan community development at Caloundra South. It was the first time that we were able to use the Green Star Communities tool. For anyone that knows Green Star or the Green Building Council of Australia has a rating tool now that measures the sustainable attributes of a community. I'm happy to say that the work that we did sort of within our own portfolio was helped influence and I guess helped structure what that might look like for a residential community. So the work that we had done in commercial property was able to be adapted to a residential community environment as one credit within a broader, larger tool that rewards developments that develop climate adaptation and resilience plans and also community resilience plans. So you can be rewarded for building adaptation resilient communities through Green Star now, which is quite innovative now. So in response to that though, the Green Building Council sees the opportunity to build that into their other suite of rating tools. So that at the moment they sit as innovation credits within Green Star, but Green Building Council will announce and launch later in the year a new rating tool that combines all of the existing rating tools into one single tool called Design and As Built, so that any projects, so if you had a master plan community that had a communities rating, you could start to construct built form that has a design and as built rating that goes along with it, that also factors in adaptation and resilience within the design of the buildings. So that, look out for that. That'll be coming later this year. So we've got action plans in place. We're responding to the issue, risks and opportunities that have been identified as a result of having done these assessments. And the idea is to move them out of that or move them down the curve of vulnerability, if you like. So in North Queensland, a lot of our shopping centres are quite exposed, quite vulnerable. By putting in place actions, we can move them back down the curve to make them less vulnerable, more resilient. We can't do much about the location. We can't pick them up and move them. They'll always be exposed to cyclones and severe weather, but we can put in place actions to make them more resilient. So over the last 12 months, we've been embedding, so taking what we've learned from doing assessments and understanding how to operationalise that through process. So we've been working with our group risk, group insurance team to turn those opportunities into processes and procedures. So I know that our group operations team is doing audits, their annual audits, and at the moment they're also auditing what's being done around climate resilience at the same time. So it's good to see that we're starting to operationalise this now. Going forward, we can see a real opportunity to help build community resilience in the way we deliver our assets and our communities, because the ability of the community to bounce back from natural disasters, if that be the case, or just being resilient in the face of those incremental climate change exposures, helps communities come together, helps them stay connected, it helps them build resilience so that they can respond as they need to when these things occur. We think as a developer of residential communities, we've got a role to play in helping build community resilience. There's still a lot more that we know we can do, but we think we're well positioned at the moment to deliver on that. We're not saying that we've done everything, we know everything, we're learning from that process and we're learning every day from this. So I think the clear message is, you learn by doing, and at the moment we're doing that, and we're seeing some great results coming out of it.
Fantastic. Lane, would you like to, I think...
No, I can do it.
You're good. Excellent.
Thanks, Mara, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to you today. As Mara suggested, I'm going to be looking at the energy sector and how it's already adapting and changing, and I'll talk a little bit about how that adapt and change relates to climate change. But firstly, I'll look at the physical risks of climate change on energy infrastructure in particular, and I'll focus on the electricity sector because that's what I know. And then I'll go and we'll actually have a look at a live heatwave week in South Australia and Victoria and just see sort of what happened, because I think it's quite a good window into the future. So look, the biggest risk to energy infrastructure is heat waves, and climate change is going to bring in more frequent heat waves in the future. I guess there's two or three ways that it affects energy infrastructure. Firstly, it actually reduces the capacity of the infrastructure to deliver energy. So the thermal efficiency of plant reduces in higher ambient temperatures. So for example, the poles and wires, transmission infrastructure, that doesn't deliver or transmit as much energy because there's higher losses and higher temperatures. And also the thermal efficiency of thermal plant, like coal-fired, gas-fired power stations, actually drops as well in higher ambient temperatures, and solar PV for that matter as well. But also at that time, because there is a heat wave, now because of so many people having air conditioners and need cooling systems, it stresses the system as well because there's very high demand during those periods. So when the system is stressed, it's also likely to be less reliable. And that's what you will see. And I think we'll have a look at that when we go through that particular heat wave earlier this year. Some plant will actually turn off to protect itself as well. So our wind turbines, when it gets around the sort of mid-40 degrees, will actually shut down until the temperature is such that it'll just automatically start up again. Drought. You know, you would expect, and it would be quite obvious, that drought is problematic for hydropower stations. And in fact, we own run-of-river hydros in Chile, and we've just experienced the worst drought ever on record. So we're actually looking forward to an El Nino, because that tends to bring more precipitation on the other side of the Pacific. But it also has some other impacts. For example, in 2007, I think we had the highest wholesale electricity prices ever because of drought, mainly driven by the Queensland power stations, which had limited cooling water and therefore couldn't produce as much energy as predicted. I understand that there has been some adaptive work done there, so that's not like, sorry, the Queensland power stations aren't likely to be so sensitive to drought conditions. But we also got to the point in Victoria where we were getting close to those power stations in the Latrobe Valley suffering from a lack of cooling water. Then on the flip side, of course, is rain and flooding, which we can expect to see more of. And you've got the example of the Yallourn power station in Victoria, which for some months had its the conveyor belts moving the coal into the power station, A, were damaged, and then B, had trouble getting to them because of flooding in the mine site. Bushfires. The obvious impact, I guess, is on the overhead transmission lines and poles and wires. They're obviously can be severely affected, and you can lose the ability to transmit power from place to place. But also, I guess, a real example of a real risk was the Hazelwood fire at the Hazelwood power station in the mine. And that demonstrated the considerable health risk to local communities when a coal mine fire starts, which is very, very difficult to put out. Stronger storms and high winds, something we expect to cause considerable damage, again, to things like overhead power lines because they're very exposed. One of the things that's coming out of it too, and it probably relates a bit to what Mike was talking about before, is that you know, what was 1 in 100 year storm is now maybe a 1 in 10, maybe a 1 in 5. So the sort of levels of insurance and who's responsible for what, you know, because of these sort of moving goalposts is a matter that's going to play out, I guess, in coming decades. And finally, the one which we probably least understand is the actual impact of climate change on the resource available, particularly for renewable energy generators. So we know that you know, it's going to get hotter, and we know that you know, there's going to be more precipitation, but it's going to happen probably shorter and faster. But when it comes down to, is there going to be more or less wind, you know, 20, 30 years down the track, and these are long-term assets, that's something there's very little information around. Examples, though, are that we expect there to be less precipitation in southeast Australia as opposed to northwest Australia. So that's why we're pleased to own the hydro on the Ord River scheme up in the northwest. So now I'm going to move to a particular heat wave. So Ilka, if you could pop that up. I'm not going to do death by PowerPoint, but this just has some graphs. So I'm just going to quickly set the scene. So the most recent heat wave in Victoria and South Australia was the week beginning the 13th of January. And the temperature for Tuesday through to Friday exceeded 40 degrees in each day in Melbourne and Adelaide. and on the Monday was above 40 in Adelaide as well. So it's the typical sort of heat wave that we get in sort of southern Australia. The demand passed 3,000 megawatts in Adelaide, which only 12 times previously, and demand over 10,000 megawatts in Victoria, which was only 8 times previously. So it gives you an idea that this was a fairly fierce heat wave. So the question is, how did we go? So let's first look at how the electricity system coped. Thank you, Ilka. And so it's interesting to see that, well, what I was talking about before about the system being stressed, the system was stressed. And so you see about 1,000 megawatts of capacity fell out of two of the coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley. The Torrens Island facility was down a couple hundred megawatts, and also the Basslink system couldn't deliver about 600 megawatts through to Victoria and South Australia, which would have been certainly would have been wanting to export it. You can see that those problems are heat related, most of them. I'm not sure whether the boiler issue one was, but the other ones definitely were. So then looking at the actual, what the market did at the time. Thank you. So we go firstly to Victoria. Now that's more of a sort of traditional system, and I might just quickly run through what's what. So there's the baseload coal that you can see at the bottom. And then the next, I think the dark blue is gas, the light blue is the Victorian hydro, then the white is the wind penetration, which is not yet so developed in Victoria. And then there's some imports which would have been coming down from New South Wales. And then you're starting to see right on the very top the sort of the impact of solar PV on people's roofs. Now it gets really far more interesting, and this is a bit more of a window into the future when you move to South Australia. And in this case you see that it's quite a stark sort of difference. So there's only a small amount of coal now still operating in South Australia. You can see that a lot of the South Australian system still relies heavily on gas. But the wind penetration now in South Australia is quite significant. I guess the imports would have been coming through from Victoria, what was sort of flows down through New South Wales and then across Victoria and then into South Australia. And now you're seeing also some really significant peaks being shaved off by solar PV. And this is starting to have quite a significant effect on the market the size of South Australia. So what we found during this very hot week was that the average price in the market did not jump up to the levels that it used to in the past. So back in January 2009, the average daily price during a heat wave like this was about $700 per megawatt hour. During this particular heat wave, it was under $200 a megawatt hour. Now that's being largely suppressed by the influence of the wind power generation and the solar PV, which is reducing the demand off the top. So look, in wrapping up, the energy systems in Australia are already sort of going through a transition, and in fact a lot of that's already customer-led. You're getting more distributed generation, which is going to provide more resilience into the electricity networks. And it actually provides a cheaper and more reliable energy supply. So you can start to imagine what a future energy supply can look like in Australia with a large penetration of renewables. And then you can see things like electric vehicles coming in, providing sort of storage capability and smoothing capability in the system. And it's also worth highlighting that as you move to a cleaner energy systems, that this will save Australia around about $9.5 billion per year. So the IMF recently did a study that determines that the health and environmental cost per year in Australia from operating coal and gas-fired power generation is $9.5 billion a year. It's around about $8 billion from coal and about $1.5 billion from gas-fired generation. So, you know, the transition to cleaner energy, you know, it's going to attract investment and jobs, and much of that is also in regional areas. So, moving to cleaner energy provides resilience, so it can both mitigate emissions and help adapt to a future that's got some challenges.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mara. Being the last speaker of the day, thanks for holding on. Hopefully you'll enjoy this one. It's a bit of a different perspective, a bit of a story of hope in some of the most vulnerable people in the challenge of climate change. So if we go to India for a minute, there are 300 million Indians living without access to electricity, living in energy poverty. That's 1/4 of the total population and equivalent to 13 times the total population of Australia. It's a huge challenge to improve the lives of all these people while at the same time minimising the effect on climate change. But with all challenges come hand in hand with opportunities. In this case, the opportunity to transform our economies through sustainable enterprise and renewable energy. Pollinate Energy is a perfect example of a sustainable enterprise doing just that. They provide solar lights to customers in urban slums through a network of micro-entrepreneurs who they train to run their own business selling the lights. They speak the local language, they know the local community, and they spend a lot of time explaining the products so they understand them and can use them long term. They provide also a 5-week payment plan so that they can afford to pay them off and then own them as well. So they are not just a handout, they've invested as well. They have a huge impact on the lives of these people. I saw firsthand while helping produce an impact assessment for Pollinate earlier this year. They help to break the cycle of poverty and in doing so increase the resilience of these people. They do this through the many benefits they offer. First and foremost, financial benefits, which when you have a different hierarchy of needs, you know, when you're trying to put food on the table, basic things like that, financial benefits are going to be the main driver. So often that's a driver for the purchase. If before the solar light, most customers have been using kerosene, so it's a small flame, it's quite expensive. It's producing smoke when they're living in a small tent. So having an incentive to straight away save money is a perfect solution in the solar light. The return on investment for customers is less than 6 months, and so in some cases we found customers able to increase their income as well by working longer hours. I met one customer in particular, Homrigh. He ran a savoury food shop in a slum community. He invested in the light because he saw the opportunities that it could bring to his business. He's now able to open his shop longer for each day, spend time at night preparing his food. The light also attracts customers as they can tell when it's open, and it's also a more social place for people to be. In just 4 months since he purchased the light, he was able to double his income, and in doing so moved out from living in the tent into an apartment nearby and bring his family from a rural area to live with him in the city. So that was a perfect example of totally transforming someone's life from a simple and affordable investment. Despite the financial savings being so convincing and making so much sense to us, the customers didn't rate it as the most important benefit. the most important benefit to them was the improved quality of family and community time. So this was basically having a brighter home, being able to socialise better, being able to spend time with the community better. Other benefits included health benefits, so inhaling kerosene fumes on a daily basis is obviously not good for one's health. So the immediate removal of that, customers spoke of coughing less and that kind of thing, even though they didn't totally understand the difference that it was making. Educational benefits are also huge, as children can study at night time. With just a kerosene lantern, that's nearly impossible. So again, just increased brightness at night time to be able to continue to do useful things with your day. The other major benefit is the ability of the lights to also charge mobile phones. Nearly every customer has a mobile phone, and the ability to charge it in their home rather than pay at a local shop is a huge advantage. It's in some cases caused problems, as they've tried to charge too many at one time and then the light stops working. But with education, that's a problem that can be fixed. And not reported by customers so much, but the environmental benefit of the lights being a solar product is also huge, and reducing kerosene emissions. One of the largest challenges for a startup social enterprise like Pollinate is creating a business model that they can scale. There's huge ambitions to expand to more cities in India and reach many more customers, and they're in the process at the moment of making sure their model's right before they start to replicate. But yeah, Pollinate is just one example of some positive momentum in addressing this challenge.
Okay, so I think you're getting the picture that there's clarity in the business community around the challenges ahead, and some of the solutions are all about community benefit and community safety, as well as coupling environmental benefits. I'm actually going to ask the first question. I'm going to take the liberty because you get to when you're moderating. This morning we talked a lot about stable, economics and thank you, degrowth. We've got more questions coming, so I won't hesitate too much on my own. And I guess part of me also, it resonates to me that there can be very important solutions out there that require growth. So I want to see companies like Stockland doing really well if they're leading on the sustainability dimensions as well as the resilient dimensions. I want to see social enterprises like Pollinate grow. I want to see them triple their revenue. I don't want to see them be stable. I want to see coastal development that has imaginative design, much like is happening now in New York City in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, where you have the world's leading engineers and architects designing communities that use nature to mitigate storm surge, and just incredible new opportunities. And of course, I want renewable energy to be part of my mix. And I guess the question to the panel is it naive to imagine that it's actually a good thing to grow these kinds of models, or is it just too connected to this incredible intensity of fossil fuels that really, if you look at the International Energy Agency, sadly, although we all talk about 2 degrees and we should, is pointing at 4 to 6 degrees at this stage. So what are the prospects for growth that actually can be part of the solution and not refuel the problem? And Greg, I'll start with you.
Oh, wow, asking me an investment question, that's dangerous. Look, I suppose if I think of Stockland at the moment, we're looking at rolling out a large solar PV program. Excuse me. And I guess it's not until we sat on our hands for a long time because we always thought, renewables were expensive. But it's not until you make a commitment to to really spend some time doing the feasibility analysis, and from that you learn not just about the feasibility of solar, but also the challenges of putting that in place and identifying which are the right assets to put it on, because not every shopping centre can support it, because there's different loads at play there. The infrastructure within a shopping centre can be quite challenging as well. So until you get off your hands and actually start putting a feasibility situation together, you can start to look at it. It turns out that it's actually, the business case is better for us to put solar on the embedded network within a shopping centre than it is to offset the base building energy usage, because we can sell the electricity to tenants and there's a profit there for us. So the return on investment's better. So again, it wasn't until we started to look at the feasibility of that that we saw that opportunity. So I guess my answer to that is do a proper feasibility, get off your hands and actually invest in doing that before you make the big leap in committing capital, and don't be scared of, or don't be sort of misled that you need to make a big leap. There's some very simple steps you can take just to get and understand the feasibility better.
Okay. And Mark, how do you see the conundrum? You've been working with local councils, many of whom I think are about to be sued, are being sued for releasing land in the wrong places, and yet we know affordable housing and coastal living is what Australians want. Do you see a positive path?
I certainly think there is. You need, I think, from a legal perspective anyway, if you have statutory guidance, then you're a long way there. So if we look at the planning regime, for example, here in Queensland, the Sustainable Planning Act is our Planning and Development Act, and that governs how development is administered and how it's assessed and how it's decided. And this Act also establishes processes for developing planning instruments like our planning schemes. Now, the Sustainable Planning Act, it talks to climate change. There are 3 references in the Act to climate change, but essentially that Act says that when you're making a decision about development, climate change has to be taken into account. Now, it's kind of hidden away in the Act, but it has been used to limit poor development or development that would be impacted by climate change. Now, what we're seeing now, and this is a long way to come around away to answer your question, but what we're seeing now is that there are planning reforms in Queensland, and under the new planning bill, climate change is being removed from the Act. Now, we see that there's a political push to remove green tape and red tape, and the idea behind that is to help with the process and speed up process and make it more efficient. But we have to look at why that regulation was there in the first place. Now, planning law is not a new concept to us all, I suppose. Planning law has been around since the turn of the century, but in Queensland it's remarkably new. And when initially it was bylaws, and then there was some very thin pieces of legislation. But we have to think about why that regulation was introduced. And it was introduced because queries arose and they had to be answered, and the only way to answer those queries was to go to the court to litigate. Now, the burden of that litigation fell on a single council or it fell on a developer. So governments over time thought it was more equitable to spread the cost of that and to add certainty to the Act by adding regulation to the Act. So the Act's got bigger and bigger, but the regulation is there for a purpose. That's to create certainty and to spread that cost and hopefully to remove that cost of litigation. Now, we see with the reduction in red tape and green tape, and a good example is under the Environmental Protection Act, where storage of used tyres was originally an environmentally relevant activity, so it was regulated. Now it's removed from that Act, and we hear stories of used tyre dumps occurring. They're potentially going to cause future environmental harm, if not now, and you would expect that that will end up in litigation. So when you, if you don't have that good guidance, you have uncertainty and you have increased costs. So I think is that sort of development possible? Yes, if we have the good guidance provided to local governments so that they can.
Okay, very good. Wayne.
Yes, look, there's a disconnection between what we're trying to achieve in terms of a transition and then the current policies and regulation that should assist us in getting there. I mean, there's no shortage of willingness at a human level to address this problem, but at a structural level, we're really, really struggling. You know, it's highly problematic that Australia has removed a carbon price from our economy. And it now means that, for example, coal-fired generators, which are a large proportion of our emissions in Australia, now have no signal and no incentive to close. And then to have so much uncertainty around the renewable energy target, it's really problematic that we're going backwards. And if you put this in a G20 context, the sort of comments we get back from other international people in our industry is they're flabbergasted. But the good news, because we better finish with some good news, is that we've found that when we actually put the resources and the people and the ingenuity that we have behind making the change, we can do it so quickly. And it's just seen every time we put a renewable energy target in, we've delivered it so much more quickly and so much more cheaply than anyone's ever expected. And I would think that we would keep doing that.
Okay, fantastic. And what are the challenges of growing a social enterprise? Because it's not easy.
Yeah, definitely not. I think, though it's a good example of taking the human need to try and do something, and also the engagement of young people we talked about earlier. I mean, Pollinate was founded by 5 young Australians who felt very passionate about the issue, and they have just gone and done it. You know, they went out there and they made it happen. Because in today's world, they've made the most of technology and all of the options of the internet and what they can do with it to build this business. And while there are challenges in expanding and duplicating the business model, I think it's a good example that yes, it can happen, and hopefully their expansion to new cities will be fruitful.
Okay, fantastic. We have got 2 questions by video and 2 questions from the floor, and we're going to run out of time unless I direct each of those to one of you. So why don't we go ahead and invite James Wilkinson. I think you had a question. Are you here, James? Yeah, wonderful, awesome. And I might actually send this one to Lane. So listen up.
Hi. Thanks for sharing with us guys as well. I'm James Wilkinson. I run a sustainability change management consultancy called Corporate Social Synergy. And my question, which I think I'm going to tweak slightly because it was kind of directed at people speaking earlier in the day, is around, we've heard, I think business is the key, personally. Obviously, being a social entrepreneur, I've got a vested interest in that kind of approach. And you being the business heads of the panel at the moment, what would you say is the single most important thing to enable business to kind of be that instigator or that creator, the starter of the change that governments then follow suit on? So just to try and kind of frame that with an example, I'm involved with a couple of NFPs that are doing campaigning work around the CDS, the Container Deposit Scheme, which we've had in South Australia for quite some time. Northern Territory just got rolled out, much to Coca-Cola's dislike. But the whole idea behind, businesses have something to benefit from a container deposit scheme. I'm thinking of the hotel and restaurant industry that go through a hell of a lot of containers on a daily basis, could actually become remunerated for those, those resources that end up in landfill, because it's not even legislated in this state that they need to have a recycling bin on their premises. So I guess my question is, what would benefit you as someone working from that business space, trying to create some change? Is it more lobbyists, more effective lobbyists? Is it a kind of government, a brand new government? Please share with me.
Clive Palmer has something to do here.
Okay, that's a slightly scary question, but it's an excellent question. Look, given the current politics, I'd say we probably have to do it without government. I think, the session before ours was really instructive on that funding is so important. So when the money runs, everyone will go with it, because there is, when we were talking about structural issues before, the fact that you have to, a business has to do the best for its shareholder. That's enshrined, so you have to do it. But if the money, if the risk becomes untenable and the money starts to run and people start to really take account of it, that will be extremely powerful in the transition. But that can also come from the other direction, which is the customer-led direction. Now, whether it's more people putting solar panels on, whether it's people buying green power, whether it's people buying ethically or doing these things that start to build that a company's reputation is important, and that people expect that companies take this seriously and are going to try and adjust their businesses. There are retailers out there, for example, who are advocating against the renewable energy target, and now there's a bit of a movement to sort of, we should move away from those to retailers that have a better, more ethical and more responsible outlook. Those sort of things are really important too, because they change the way that people talk about companies and the way that they buy, and consumers are extraordinarily powerful. So I think between the two different directions, and we'll keep trying with government, but there you go.
Okay, Tracy Churchill, are you still with us? I believe you had a question for Greg.
Yes, this is a question for you, Greg. Congratulations to Stockland to embracing the Green Star community rating tool. I assume they're also using the building scale tool as well.
Yep.
Nice to see you heading in that direction. I guess my question is more in relation to a bit bigger scale, and what responsibility are Stockland taking in terms of their contribution to, say, the urban heat island effect, making very large, concrete, pretty dominated developments, in terms of its impact on reducing permeability of the soil and therefore increasing floodability downstream and risk to those communities. Also in terms of where it is located, and I guess in reference to the last one, Caloundra South comes to mind as a risk to Pelican Waters and the whole hydrology of that catchment. And secondly, in terms of locations such as Yarrabilba, where you've got an increased reliance on car use because it's not connected to major transport uses, to major transport networks.
Sorry, Greg.
Hard for me to respond directly to some of the questions on Caloundra because I'm not directly involved in that, so that's not me trying to get out of it. I really don't know the answers other than to say I know it's quite sensitive, and I know there's a very thick environmental management plan that went along with it, and I know that there are measures in place that are protecting that, and I hope that's the message that's getting across, the impacts on Pumicestone Passage, and I know that much. Stockland's certainly very conscious of those environmental risks and impacts, so I know that there are measures in place that address that. But maybe to the main question around how do we deal with urban environments, urban heat island, those impacts from built form. I guess it's something that we've learned along the way, and we've probably learned from making mistakes as well, but I think our community development strategy really underpins a lot of how that plays out now, because there's a very strong focus on health and well-being in the community. We've got three key themes in our community development strategy, so it's health and well-being, lifelong learning and prosperity, and our sense of belonging and vitality. And a lot of those words are kind of wrapped up in how we build communities that people want to be a part of. How we improve the health and well-being of the community by providing infrastructure that promotes activity. I guess coincidentally, a lot of those amenities that promote healthy lifestyles also help manage stormwater issues as well. So where we've got water-sensitive urban design, we integrate walkways, cycleways and recreational facilities that serve those two purposes. So I think some of that urban heat island effect's taken up by creating green space that helps offset and soak up some of that heat island effect. I guess we're doing some work around what that means as well in terms of building materials and roofing systems. We're doing some work in Harvey Bay on a shopping centre on a cool roof using a steel product that actually helps create a cooler environment. So some of it's to do with research, but look, it's a bit of a long answer, but I think some of it's wrapped up in community development. Obviously, we're conscious of the things that we need to do from a planning perspective around flood management and stormwater management. But as I say, some of that you can be very clever about how you deliver that by also creating community assets that go along with it. I hope that answers some of the question.
And Tracy, I might add that I think it's on November 12th, Greg is joining the Business Adaptation Network in Melbourne for an event hosted by Australia Post, where we'll talk about property resilience for all of Australia Post's offices, networks, buildings around the country. And City of Melbourne's Urban Forest team will also be part of that event, talking about mitigating both flood and heat wave through green infrastructure and using that as part of a new model for especially regional development, but even in the centers of our big cities, like inner Melbourne. So another positive example of hopefully the new direction with the legacy of the old. Okay, we have a video question, which is submitted from Jody Wells. And I might invite Kate to listen up on this one.
The move towards solar energy leaves a high percentage of lower socio-economic status people on the grid, increasing the cost for them. Is this desirable, or are there solutions to this problem?
Tough one.
Yeah, I think it's not a simple question, but I think making, like at the moment, coal would still be, like the grid is still the cheaper option, and for example, Pollinate's customers that are getting solar lights, they're not on the grid, so they're not being taken off the grid. So I don't think in a lot of cases for example, the slums of India where Pollinate operates, that would be happening as such. And I would think in a more holistic point of view, hopefully renewables would become more part of the grid. And so it would affect everyone at the same time rather than making a disparity between different groups.
And I think in the short term, it actually is a real issue. You know, I've been involved, I don't know if others on the panel would like to comment, but this is something that comes up when you talk about vulnerable communities, people that live in apartments, for example, where there is no solar and they're just copying the increased price of grid electricity, which goes up and up and up, whereas middle class and upper income people can afford to borrow money to actually put solar on to mitigate those costs. So part of the answer, I think, is around energy efficiency. Part of the answer is around community scale solar. And part of the answer is about the gradual decarbonization of the grid as a whole, which will create a blended price, which, you know, hopefully 10, 20 years from now is more balanced. Would anyone else like to have a comment on that, or please? Wayne.
There's, the electricity prices have been rising quite significantly over about the last 4 or 5 years. And the bulk of that's actually come from the distribution transmission network charges rather than in the wholesale generation charge. But what we also do know is that, and the modelling was done by the government as part of the RET review, is the more renewables you put in, the more it suppresses the wholesale energy price, which effectively means if you can keep a lid on the distribution and transmission prices, then you'll keep a lid on prices on the network anyway. So yes, for those that physically can't get solar on their roof because they don't have a roof, because someone else is above them or whatnot, you know, that is an important factor. Although the only other thing to comment is that a great deal of the solar that's already being put on roofs in Australia is not the higher socio-economic group. A lot of it is the lower socio-economic household.
Yeah.
And so you can assist too for those who do have a roof by providing cheaper funding, which is one of the things that was talked about earlier.
Okay, fantastic. So we had another video question, and I might introduce it because actually it comes from a close friend of mine, and I feel like in this time of global tension, and with Australia kind of moving into this situation now in the Middle East, and with the G20 looking at security and energy in a different kind of way, this question is submitted by Steve Killalay. And do we have that question up there? If not, Karen, I'm sure does have it. Okay, excellent. So I'll just tell you who Steve is. So Steve is a software entrepreneur from Sydney. He founded a company called Integrated Research, which is a financial services productivity software. He floated it in 2000. I was at Macquarie Bank at the time, got to know him very well. Steve did very well because 2000 was a good time to float a company. And he made a lot of money, and he invested it in two projects. One, he has the country's largest overseas aid donation charity. It's called the Charitable Foundation, and I think it invests, quite a quantum, $5–10 million a year on overseas aid, mostly clean water. But his second and brilliant project is something called the Global Peace Index, and that measures. It's a joint venture with the Economist Intelligence Unit and MIT, and it measures the underlying peacefulness of 92 nations, and beginning to look at prosperity, economic development, and the underlying pillars, the foundations of peace. And because Steve travels the world quite a bit, mostly in Africa and Asia, around and increasingly the Middle East, his sense of foresight about the mobility of people related to the impacts of climate change and what this will mean, I think is very important for this group to consider, and indeed for the G20 to consider. So, Mark, I know it's not your area of law, but I'm going to invite you to have a go at this because it's a pretty fundamental question.
It's estimated that there are 60 million refugees currently around the world. This is the largest since the Second World War. 30 years from now, with the advent of climate change, in areas of the world, such as the subcontinent of India, possibly collapsing, what's the likely number of refugees moving around the world? What is the likely economic impact of this?
Oh, that's an easy question. I don't know the answer to that. I appreciate that it's an issue. It's an issue for us here in Australia because we've got our Pacific neighbours who are going to be who are threatened and will be more threatened and challenged by climate change, and it's something that certainly we need to deal with. I can say that we don't have a legislative, a statutory or a convention that adequately deals with displaced people. I know there's been a lot of research and discussion about the convention, the Refugee Convention, and whether climate change refugees, and it's probably not the appropriate term, but whether the convention allows for people who are displaced because of climate change to be relocated into another place. I think it's just something that we need to consider, we need to give more thought to, and we need to come up with a solution because, look, I don't know about the numbers, and there's been a lot of discussion about what the actual numbers will be, about people being displaced across borders, but certainly I think the numbers are real for people being displaced within a single territory, and it's something, perhaps here in Australia too, even without our Pacific neighbours, that we need to give serious thought to. Again, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
No, it's impossible to answer. Okay, so that brings to a close this final session, and I hope it gives you a sense of the importance of being awake to the real challenges of coming decades. It's one thing for us to work very hard to minimize them, and it's another to embrace them and work very hard now to improve those conditions going forward, and gives me great hope that business is really thinking about this. So can we thank our wonderful panel for sharing their thoughts with us? And I was going to pass this over to Jeremy, but I don't know where he is. Ah, there he is. Yay.
Okay, so I'm in the very dangerous position now of being the man between the audience and cocktails. So I shall be as brief as I possibly can. I've got a list here which I need to talk about in no particular order. Don't forget to do our Green Economy Survey. There's a link on this little card here. I'd be very grateful if you did it. And we might just spam you one more time after this conference and send you an email link, but we'd really appreciate your contribution to this. And who knows, it might actually end up being a semi-serious academic paper as well. Rob Hales. So that's the first thing. Second thing, thank you, Mara, for being such a grand help. You may have noticed that every time we've had a speaker, we've handed them a little envelope, which is actually a promise of a present. Because we ordered this really great book at the recommendation of Ilka Nelson, The Man Who Planted Trees. It's a short story. It's a fantastic little read. Thoroughly commend it to you all. And we've ordered these from Amazon.com. And even with the amazing conference organising abilities of Karen Brindley, she couldn't get Amazon to deliver on time, although they may be in the office at Nathan today. We do have one copy come, so we think it's only appropriate that we give this to you, Mara.
Oh.
And the rest of you will have to wait. It'll come in the post.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
Okay, so that's one of the thank yous. Thank you to Jen and Jess and Amy, our brilliant Bachelor of Business Sustainable Enterprise helpers who've been here hither and thither, making sure we've oiled the wheels of this conference. Thanks to Ilka Nelson, who's just leaning up against the tech bar area there, who is just one of the most creative people that walks the planet. All of the graphics you've seen on the screen today are all her doing, and the design of the flyers and so forth. She's a very creative person, so thanks to Ilka. Thank you also to Janet Palmer. Where is she? Janet Palmer's over there. Thank you, Janet, for being a Twitter goddess and all-round multimedia star. Thank you for that. Special thank you to Karen Brindley, who is trying to remain anonymous over there. If we were to talk about Premier League conference organising skills, although she won't thank me for saying it, she's the Chelsea of conference organising. She's actually a Stoke City supporter, so her husband won't like that particular comparison, but you know, all of us in the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise know that this was always going to be a smooth conference with Karen organising it. So thank you, Karen, for that. I mentioned at the start that we were going to produce a document to include all of the key points and reflections over the 4 sessions today. And I mentioned the 4 individuals who are going to be scribes. I think there may be a 5th, Heather Pearce, Chris Hill. I'm not sure how you organise that, but we do want to have some tangible outcome from today, and it'll be a work in progress for a little while once we bring the contributions together and we've done a little bit of editing. And if any of you have any thoughts and contributions you'd like to make, then please drop us an email to Karen and myself. Anything that really struck you as being an important point and you'd like to see included in that document, please let us know. And we want to get this published somewhere and send it to our politicians. This is going to be a contribution from civil society about economic growth, climate change in the G20, because it's not something that's going to be talked about, or at least it's not mooted as being something to be talked about at the meeting next month. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to put this conference on. It's been a lot of thought gone into it, as you can imagine, not least because we wanted to get a diversity of people. So, I mean, I'm sure some of the individuals you've been interacting with today come from very different fields from your own. We've got old and young, we've got a good gender balance, we've got developed country, less developed country, we've got business, we've got NGOs, we've got academics. We've tried our best to get a real hodgepodge of individuals to get this cross-pollination of ideas. And that's why I think we can say that the outcome, the document that we produce, will be a truly representative view from civil society about the important issues that we've been discussing today. I'd like also, if any of you feel the slightest bit compelled to do so, to provide unsolicited feedback to the Griffith University Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Engagement, Professor Martin Betts. He's very interested to know what kind of activities we academics get involved in, and I think this is an important role for universities to play. I've had a number of people come today and say, this is the best event on this subject I've ever been to. And certainly one of the best events they've been to in Queensland, because we don't have intelligent conversations about these important issues enough, in my opinion. And I think it's a true and important role for a university to play. So I need your help to endorse that, if you think, of course, that is true. And certainly if you could pass on your unsolicited comments, that would be very helpful. That's all I have to say. Thank you, all of you. I've said all the thank yous, but thank you all for coming along today and staying to the bitter end. I'm speaking for all of my colleagues in the centre as well. It's going to mean that we leave today with a warm glow, knowing that hopefully we have had a contribution to informing the debate on these important topics. Thank you very much. Mara wants to say one last thing.
I just wanted to follow up on that positive note. For Queenslanders, which I guess kind of is us, other than the guests that are here, it has been a really interesting kind of shift, the climate discussion, since I've been here for the last 8 years or so. And I know that it's very, very challenging, but in the great hope that somehow we can begin to really cut above politics and bring it down to a practical level, I was just so happy to note that through the various incarnations, I don't know if many of you noticed, but in the final version of the Queensland Plan, renewable energy actually features, which is a really major development compared to the first version. And part of that was because of a relentless bit of feedback that came from you and your friends and others, and that is truly an extraordinary thing. And the other thing, which I think is remarkable, is quite recently, Green Cross Australia was engaged by the Queensland government to support development of the Queensland Climate Adaptation Strategy. And that will reach across all sectors. And we'll look at these issues from the perspective of community well-being, natural disasters, different areas. And if you want to be a part of that conversation, it will be led by and developed in partnership with everyone that wants to be in that tent. Really look forward to working with Griffith, David Hood, QUT, UQ, all the other universities, CSROs, the business community, the community sector. This is an opportunity for us to really understand the challenges that lie ahead and come at a partnership, collaborative approach to addressing them. So I just wanted to mention that as another way to take the conversation going forward.
And keep that conversation going on the deck. We have drinks outside. Thank you.